Welcome back, everyone. I am Cass Piancey, and I'm joined, as usual, by my partner in crime, Mr. Bennett Tomlin. How are you today?
Well, I'm doing well. How are you, Cass?
It's been yet another hectic week in the world of cryptocurrency, and today we're joined by a special guest, a friend of the show, previous guest, Mr. Domingo Flores. How are you today?
Well, I'm doing fine, thank you. And I hope you guys are also having a fine day.
Yeah, I'd say fine just about describes it. You're joining us today because we are going to be talking about a topic near and dear to our heart, not only El Salvador, but kind of all the things going on with El Salvador, their Volcano Bitcoin bond, Mr. Nayib Bukele, and the host of problems that we're seeing popping up. And for anyone who's unfamiliar, Domingo, can you go ahead and just give us an overview of what these volcano bonds or volcano tokens, I guess is what they're being called now, but these volcano bonds, what they entail, what the purpose is, what the goal is with these?
November 2021, Bukele announced that they were going to build Bitcoin City. It was going to be financed by volcano bonds, which was rather weird. And in the following weeks of that announcement, he made clear that the volcano bonds were supposed to raise $1 billion, half of which would be used to buy Bitcoin, and the other half would be used to build Bitcoin City.
Bitcoin City, just for anyone unfamiliar with what Bitcoin City is going to be or was supposed to be or what the plan is, can you go ahead and describe that as well?
So Bitcoin City is supposed to be a city that's going to be built in the La Unión, the Union Department in El Salvador, next to Conchagua Volcano. It's supposedly going to be powered by geothermal energy from a plant that does not exist yet. And that there's not even a study that says that geothermal energy is viable from Conchagua Volcano. So the whole thing was supposed to be this futuristic city that is going to be, if you live there, if you invest your Bitcoins in Bitcoin City, you were supposed to don't have to pay any taxes at all, property taxes or anything. And instead, the city was going to be funded by Bitcoin mining that was going to be done using the energy from the geothermal plant that doesn't yet exist, and that the trials that they've done yet are not profitable. This thing is effectively never going to be built. I said it nearly, 9 months ago when we last talked, and I repeat it again. And as of yet, there is no evidence that this thing is ever going to exist.
And that's just, and that's just half of it. I kind of derailed you there. But the reason that we have you back on and talking with us today is because the Congress of El Salvador has moved forward with this, and they have started setting up the procedures necessary. They've done this digital assets law. If you can jump into the digital assets law, what is happening with this, what the goal is with this, and how soon we can maybe see these volcano tokens hit the market.
This law has a bit of a crisis of identity. Bitfinex describes it as a securities law. The Bitcoin agency on Twitter, that the government-managed Twitter account, describes it as a securities law. Hilariously says, Bitcoin is legal tender, everything else is a security. However, if you actually read the law, Article 3 says explicitly that all digital assets covered by this law are not securities. How's that sound? And not only that, but just to give some background, El Salvador already has some securities laws and regulations that are fairly compatible with the US because, of course, we're dollarized. We use the US dollar as our currency. So we have to have some kind of compatible legislation, and this has been in place for decades, literally. So the digital assets law is ambiguous intentionally where it wants to be, and very specific also where it wants to be. And where it's very specific is what existing laws and regulations are not applicable to the digital assets. Let's just call them cryptos, because that's just what they are. What laws and regulations are not applicable to crypto? The Code of Commerce, the Securities Market Law, the investment law, and comically, the electronic securities law. So, okay, it's a securities law as described by Bitfinex and everyone else, that says that crypto, the thing that it's supposed to regulate, are not securities. So, does this sound like just legal legal lingo to skip over securities regulations in the U.S. to have access to U.S. dollars from U.S. investors in El Salvador?
It sounds to me, at least based on what I've seen of it so far, that it was less of securities regulation and more of securities exemption, allowing these entities, these approved entities, to issue and trade these without having to, as you mentioned, go through the normal securities regulation process. One of the things that's interesting in the bill that you brought my attention to was the way they define issuer. And I think that's especially interesting in light of our previous discussions about how the Bukele administration, or people close to the Bukele administration, have discussed the possibility of issuing their own new digital Colón, their own kind of stablecoin. Can you talk a little bit about the definition of issuer in the bill here?
I'm going to just give some context that Bitfinex and Tether have been very publicly influencing the creation of this law since last year. And all throughout the year, there's been Bitfinex executives traveling to El Salvador, appearing in Congress, not saying much publicly, but it's very obvious that they've been influencing the creation of this bill. And specifically, I'm going to read verbatim in English the definition of what an issuer is. It says, issuer refers to the state or natural or a natural or judicial person, private or public, that makes or promotes an offer of digital assets to the public, or that seeks the admission of a digital asset with the objective of selling or trading on an exchange platform, centralized or decentralized, regulated or not. That's a fraction of what it says. But this is ambiguous enough to cover everything from Tether to, I don't know, Sushi Swap, Mango Markets, whatever. Every crypto entity fits within that definition. But also it very specifically mentions that it can be a state person, meaning state-owned entity, like the central bank or any national bank or any really entity within the government. So it is the central bank was previously in charge of issuing the Colón when it was still in use. So does this mean that they can then mint a token and offer it as a security that is not a security? Certainly sounds like it. Now, what's also interesting is that in the Article 5, I think, well, it has a list of definitions that are relevant to this law because it refers to these terms several times. And one of the terms that it has is a stable coin. And it also refers to reference assets. Again, very much in the language that Tether and Bitfinex use to define their Tether token, basically. So this doesn't say it doesn't say it outright, but it strongly implicates that El Salvador, as a state, is going to start issuing tokens that are backed by something. Could be dollars, or stupidly, it could be Bitcoin. Why could it be Bitcoin? And why it doesn't make sense to have a stable coin backed by a non-stable asset as Bitcoin. However, the law specifically addresses that the Bitcoin Management Agency shall be created, and that this Bitcoin Management Agency is the one that's going to manage the funds, safeguarding the funds, backing whatever it is that the state issues. It will issue a stable coin, derivative, whatever. The Bitcoin Management Agency is going to safeguard and manage it.
We talked about this, I think, last time you were on, that with the Faro reporting of the discussions in the administration about potentially wanting to issue their own kind of token, possibly partially backed by Bitcoin or backed by a mixture of Bitcoin, dollar, and perhaps sovereign debt or whatever. That's been a topic of discussion within the administration. And so I think it is certainly something they're probably still considering, especially when you have the expertise of the largest stablecoin issuer in the world on your side. But What's perhaps almost more interesting to me around this is kind of a constellation of several things, which make it seem like Bukele has an interest in making El Salvador appealing to a very specific type of person. In the prospectus, marketing materials, deck, whatever you want to call the thing that they were passing around when the bond was first proposed, they talked about how investing in the bond would be one way for people to effectively purchase citizenship in El Salvador. We've seen recently the El Salvador government ignore extradition requests for gang leaders and then release them from prison. And we've seen this bill, like the DARE Act in the Bahamas, has pretty low caps on the maximum penalties for certain types of digital asset crimes. And this constellation of things coming together feels like Bukele and the El Salvador government trying to make El Salvador appealing to the worst actors in cryptocurrency. Is that kind of the impression you've gotten from trying to follow this?
Yes, I've been saying it for a long time. The main actual use case of cryptocurrency right now is crime, and Bukele is essentially broadcasting, look, I didn't extradite this gang member that's accused of murdering how many ever people to the US. I refused to extradite him. Instead, I gave him an official guard to accompany him to leave the country in freedom. What makes you think he's going to extradite a white-collar criminal like SBF? So that's a lot of advertising for the worst kind of criminal.
I want to jump in there because there's two things I want to say. One, you're saying one of the only use cases is crime, and while I think there's something to be said about that, certainly, I think the number one use case right now for Bitcoin and most other cryptocurrencies is speculation. And if you reflect on that, then it's even in a sense like more troubling that the country of El Salvador and the leadership of El Salvador is now going to be relying on incredibly volatile assets to essentially back their country, to ensure that their country is not going to slip into unrecoverable debt, into bankruptcy. I mean, like into who knows what. So I think there's something to be said there. And if you want to comment on that.
Well, and on that point, I think that's especially jarring when we see like Samson Mao down in El Salvador trying to promote these things and then using a model where he claims you can conservatively project a 60% annual return for Bitcoin. And like conservatively projecting a 60% annual return for multiple years is wild. You end up with like a Bitcoin price larger than the world GDP by like 2027 or by like 2030 or something crazy. Like within a few years, it's the biggest thing that's ever existed.
Yeah.
And that's conservative.
I agree.
Is what they're promoting.
Yeah, maybe he meant conservative in the fascist sense. I very much agree with your assessment. And we already have experience in El Salvador when we mix up the crypto world with the real banking world in the events that transcurred in last year with Chivo Wallet. They essentially, the government essentially bullied the national banks, national private banks, into integrating with Chivo Wallet. And what happened was comical. I want to say comical. Basically, you were able to, if you had your Chivo wallet, you had like a balance of $5 in Bitcoin in your Chivo wallet, and you wanted to withdraw $1,000 to your bank account, you could link your Chivo wallet to your bank account. I don't know, fat finger a couple extra zeros in there, and the money would be credited to your account and not be discounted from your Bitcoin wallet because obviously you didn't have it. So this happened in a span of like 24 hours, which is something we now know only thanks to the core documents from the Athena versus Sean Overton in the US. That happened in the span of 24 hours. Over $1 million were lost. Because people started fat fingering, or they obviously realized, hey, I withdrew $1,000 and I only had 10. I slipped a couple extra zeros. I'm going to do it again. And just a a group of less than a dozen people withdrew over $1 million. A dozen people. And there's also an untold large number of people that also fat fingered their Chivo withdrawals from their Chivo wallet, but obviously weren't prosecuted because it wasn't a significant enough amount that the bank couldn't handle it by themselves. However, if you think about that slip, it's hemorrhaging money. Not to mention what we also learned from the Sean Overton testimony. What I said on last time on your podcast, that we had actively warned the government through their contractor Ulter that they were going to have a mass fraud because their KYC system was weak. Sean Overton testified and said, although he didn't mention us specifically, I mean the company I worked for, but he did mention that a contractor warned them that this was going to happen, and they consciously, intentionally, I guess, said, no, let's go ahead with zero KYC. Whatever goes, we have to present the number or the illusion that Chivo Wallet is successful. And well, you see what happens now. You have thousands of cases of identity theft and fraud. Those $30 bonus has been. I don't think there's a national ID number that hasn't had their $30 withdrawn. It's an hemorrhage of money, and I guess I just want an excuse to quote my childhood hero, the Iron Sheik. Just because you're good at something doesn't mean you're one dumb son of a bitch. These guys were incredibly dumb in facilitating that. As much praise as the Bitcoin cult and the crypto cult throws at Bukele, this was incredibly stupid, and it continues to be.
That's actually something I wanted to touch on really quickly, because I've personally, and Protos, the company that I work for, has also experienced this level of, like, I will say it's like bordering on cultish, where any criticism of Bukele is pushed back on with seemingly like whataboutism about like Ortega or like other dictators and other countries that are doing bad things, where it's like, well, why don't you focus on those guys? And I guess I'm wondering if you feel like, since we last spoke, if things are worse in El Salvador than when we spoke previously, and if there is any reason to believe or perceive Nayib Bukele as anything less than a dictator at this point.
There is absolutely no reason to perceive him as anything other than a dictator. There's flagrant human rights abuses. I think the best way to illustrate that is with a story. A short story. In El Salvador, there's this poor community called Bajo Rio Lempa, the lower bank of the Lempa River, the most important river in El Salvador, where there's a lot of small communities, poor communities, that basically just try to live and get by. And the school children of one of these communities were rehearsing a theater play that was about the national history of El Salvador and basically covered the war. What happened? Can you guess what happened? Don't, actually. The army came in, arrested all these children, ages 13 to 17, literally tortured them for days because they were obviously portraying the army as bad, because the army objectively did, crimes against humanity in the war. That's El Salvador. That's Nayib Bukele's security policies. There's no other category to put Nayib Bukele in other than a fascist dictator. Now, about the cult of personality around Bukele, this is very artificial. Most people that praise him are people like, Max Kaiser, Stacey Herbert, Samson Moe, people that have an economic interest in the government bankrolling their Ponzi scheme, basically. Plus, you have, I feel I gotta mention it. You got the Bukele owned and managed troll center. If you take a stroll over my Twitter account and several other people I follow in the Salvadoran critics of the government and critics of Bukele's policies, you start to notice a trend that every time I post something critical of Bukele that reaches a certain level of engagement on Twitter, let's say, for example, 50 to 100 likes, immediately you start seeing trolls responding with like homophobic slurs because I have the rainbow pride flag on my profile, or generally any kind of insult, whataboutism, and things that feel very inorganic from people that do not follow me. And this is because Bukele actually manages a troll center. Reuters, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right. Reuters did an article on that where they interviewed several ex-employees from the troll center where they said, oh, well, I feel bad because I essentially got paid to attack human rights defenders, to attack this woman that had an abortion and was in jail and was protesting, to attack, families that were protesting that their children, their husbands, their mothers were imprisoned arbitrarily. So yeah, there's absolutely no other term to call Bukele other than a fascist dictator, in my opinion. And again, just want to go back to the volcano bonds, which I kind of find really interesting. So the volcano bonds, like Frank Muci expertly said, never made a lick of sense. Now, in the press material that Bitfinex and the government has been pushing around lately, they're no longer calling them volcano bonds, but volcano tokens, which I find really interesting because does that not sound familiar, that you're going to issue a public offering for a crypto asset, which is essentially securities fraud, but because the law now says that crypto stuff is not securities, will now be legal and will now allow U.S. investors to power their U.S. dollars in El Salvador to buy the crypto volcano tokens. Does that not sound familiar?
Yeah, I actually want to, just so everyone is on the same page here, I'm just going to read this to our audience. Bitfinex released this statement on January 11th. We're recording on January 20th, so this is 9 days ago. And it says, paving the way for the Volcano Token. The 33-page digital securities bill was originally proposed in November of 2022 and is expected to lay the legal groundwork to allow the nation to move forward with its so-called, and now this is in quotes, so-called volcano bond. The volcano bond, which is more accurately described as volcano token, which never once did they ever say this was a token before right now. Or like that it would be better served to be called a token than a bond. Like it really felt like they were pushing the narrative that this was a bond, that this was the first blockchain bond. And now it seems like there's a hard pivot to like, actually, it's not really a bond, it's a token. It's a digital token, which would, quote, help El Salvador to raise capital to pay down its sovereign debt, direct funds towards the creation of Bitcoin mining infrastructure, and fund the construction of Bitcoin City. Now, again, that sounds exactly like a bond. Why they're deciding to call it token probably is for the exact reason that you just described, which is then it doesn't fall under these weird, it's not a security, it's not a bond, it's not anything. It just exists in limbo where it can be traded and have value and nobody cares what it's called. It's just, a token.
When I started to think about why they would do this, why have a volcano token that to seasoned investors has all the red flags of a rock pool that's backed by the state. Why create this? And then I started to kind of come up with scenarios on why this could exist. And now I think I came up with 3 scenarios, which I'm going to list now. And first one is the digital assets law states that El Salvador can now print stablecoins if they want. In the tradition of stablecoins, they could be on-back stablecoins. They could trade them for tethers, and thus they could enable Tether to print and burn tokens as needed to maintain the price of Bitcoin at whatever it's convenient to them. Meanwhile, they could be writing Tether could be writing that those tethers are backed by government-approved digital assets. Why we all know that there's a few parts of the law that I didn't get to yet, and one important one is the creation of the Digital Assets Commission. Well, I'm just gonna call it the Commission for short. The Commission is a regulatory body that's going to be launched in 90 days from from when the law goes in force. So we should be seeing it in around 3 months. But basically, the commission has some interesting powers or interesting responsibilities, such as approving any public offering of any security that's not a security, aka anything like the Volcano tokens. They also have the authority to approve the hiring of an external auditor and to approve and certify the audit that comes from an external auditor of a digital assets provider, aka Tether. So this is a way to, what I'm saying is this is a way to legitimize the Tether business, because I guess they're going to hire one of the big 12 auditors to run the audit for Tether once they set up shop in El Salvador. They also have a means to I guess, manipulate the market and have it be backed by the Salvadoran state. And 3, I guess, this also serves, again, as a proxy or to circumvent securities regulations and get U.S. investors U.S. dollars in El Salvador.
I think that last point you made might likely be the most important, right? And we talked about this a little more in depth in episode 91 when Frank Muci was on. He's a development economist, about some of the fiscal and financial challenges facing El Salvador right now with their debts that are coming due in the next few years and just the lack of liquidity and adequate assets and cash to cover it. And one of the things that I think is interesting is over the last few months, there have been more and more government employee and government funded, people who are funded by the Salvadoran government who have been striking in El Salvador due to complaints about not getting paid. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in the last time, in last episode I was mentioning that the Salvadoran government is running out of money, evidenced by the fact that they're not paying their policemen, they're not paying their doctors, they're not paying their lawyers and their employees in general. Now, the situation has only grown more dire now 7-8 months in. Right now, there's a proposal from Bukele and his vice president to reduce the number of districts of mayor's offices in El Salvador down to 50 or 100. I can't quite remember right now, but that's just insane. And this comes in the wake of exactly what you mentioned. A lot of municipal offices aren't paying their employees. They haven't been paid since October, some of them. And what has been the reaction of Bukele? Instead of, look, let's have a conversation, let's divert funds from this Bitcoin City project or whatever into paying our employees, the response has been, okay, we're going to reduce the number of municipal offices. We're going to arrest the union workers and the workers that joined the protest because they're not being paid. And I mean, yeah, it's terrible. This has only grown more dire, and the end of January is slowly approaching. The Eurobonds are due by the end of this month. I think it's between 600 and 800 million. They are likely going to pay that with more debt. If they can secure it, I do not know if they have, because the Bukele regime is very allergic to transparency. So I don't really have any hard data to prove that they are going to be solvent. They're going to be fulfilling their debt obligations. We're talking about external debt obligations, but we already see that they're not fulfilling their internal debt or obligations by not paying their workers. Well, leave debt aside, they're not paying their salaries. So, yeah, there's that.
Meanwhile, I
And
just want to point out that the Bitfinex announcement said a new financial center for hyper-Bitcoinization. With the passage of the digital asset issuance legislation, El Salvador is actively positioning itself to realize its vision to become a leading financial center for the global Bitcoin economy, similar to the current roles played by nations like Switzerland, Luxembourg, Singapore, and of course the nations of London and New York, which I guess I just learned right now are nations. So gracias to Bitfinex for that beautiful lesson in what El Salvador is destined to become. I guess a nation state with high GDP per capita, which like what you're saying to me right now, it is at odds deeply with that message, is what I'm trying to point out, is that you're talking about a country deeply in debt that is struggling to pay off these bonds that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars right now, that is going to get further into debt to pay off those bonds that are due. And I think they're trying to express that this will save El Salvador, that this Bitcoin token, I guess is what we're calling it now, this Bitcoin token is going to save El Salvador.
Well, if it increases conservatively at 60% per year, then in 3 years, all of El Salvador's debts will be paid off or something like that. Whatever it was Samson Mao was pretending was logical or reasonable or connected to reality.
This is where I'm leading, which is like, do we think that the next move here is to just continually issue these tokens to try to what is the end goal here? How do they make this work in their favor in a hypothetical world? Like, how does this work in a way where it actually, besides the hypothetical conservative 60% a year gains, like how would this work otherwise, is my question, I guess, for either one of you at this point.
Before I give it a shot to answering that, I want to point out that the law also states that all digital assets covered under it are tax-free, 100% tax-free. And of course, it sets some financial penalties for violating the terms of the law. These financial penalties are laughable. The highest financial penalty is about $500,000, increased by 50% if if you're a repeat offender. I mean, this is chump change. SBF probably spent that much bringing stuff in private planes from Amazon to the Bahamas on a monthly basis. And given the fact that you don't have to pay taxes, this is basically, I guess, paying the fine as an operational cost. The other highest penalty is up to 100% of your public offering value, but that's only if you don't register with the commission. Which, I mean, why wouldn't you? If you're looking at paying only $500,000 for your crimes, what's the likely scenario that we see working in their favor? And to that, I say to you, you can't be both malicious and incompetent at the same time. I don't think there's a scenario where this is going to be good for the country, either as they intend or as they have ambitions. It's just basically a short-term vision of fleecing investors, and then who knows what happens next, though. I guess we'll see. If Bukele remains in power, I guess he can just not prosecute anyone as he is doing now.
So what you're saying is you see it as more of a Hail Mary to make Nayib, like, fine, but in terms of El Salvador, you don't really see a way that this could possibly genuinely benefit the country.
No, there's no way this is going to be beneficial to any Salvadoran outside the Bukele circle or the, I guess, people directly involved with Bitfinex. I guess you could say someone's going to benefit if that someone is like a Russian mobster or a Colombian cartel that wants to launder the dollars with Bitcoin tokens, but they're not yet Salvadorans. They have to pay some Bitcoins for that.
I alluded to part of this earlier with like them refusing to abide by their extradition treaty with the United States. And we know, or we believe from reporting by Faro and others, that the Bukele administration has entered into deals and negotiations with organized crime before and has struck deals with organized crime before. There's very low penalties for this bill. There's a way to purchase citizenship. My intuition is that the interpretation of this is they desperately need money in their banking system that they can, and money in their government to continue to pay their debts. By creating a bill that basically eliminates penalties, signaling that you're not going to abide by previous extradition treaties, and allowing this type of behavior, you start to attract more capital into the country. The legitimate economic development vision of this would be, even if you're not taxing those specific transactions, having the capital there, paying other people, you can collect taxes as that activity diffuses out into the economy. If instead you are corrupt and are willing to negotiate and make deals with criminals, then you're potentially also in a position where you can entrench your own power by entering into unofficial deals where you're taking payments in kind or receiving other value for allowing these people to operate in your country. And so because the government of El Salvador is in a position where they are so desperate for cash, so desperate to be able to continue to pay their debts, they are acting in a way where they're trying to attract people with capital regardless of the quality of the people. And then Bukele can potentially use that to help further entrench himself into power by making these people dependent on him and him dependent on these people. Is that going to make El Salvador a massive center for money laundering until correspondent banks start threatening to cut them off or actually cutting them off? Quite possibly, but it helps Bukele maintain power for now and for the next several years.
Yes, I very much agree. You have to keep in mind a couple of ongoing developments. Bukele is very much militarizing the country, and also there was recently something that honestly took years of my life. They announced a reform on the pensions law, where El Salvador is one of the only two countries in the world, the other one being Chile, and they just basically set fire to their country in order to get rid of it, where we have private pension management funds, which are private companies that take a cut of your salary, of your monthly salary, and supposedly invest it in government bonds and other investment, vehicles to provide you with a pension when you retire, right? Right now, one of the big campaign promises of Bukele was to get rid of these things because absolutely nobody wants them. They are a cancer in society, and they pay you... Well, let me just put it this way. Living wage in El Salvador is somewhere around $500 to $600 minimum wage. The absolute minimum wage is $365. If I was Salvadoran, if I was working in El Salvador, earning about $1,500 a month, at the time that I retire, my monthly pension would be close to, I guess, $400 a month, which is not a living wage. It's barely above minimum wage. It's terrible. In order for me to have a pension roughly equal to my salary, I would have to be earning 10 times more, which is crazy for El Salvadoran wages. Now, this law, instead of getting rid of it like everyone wanted, basically raised the minimum pensions a little to make them closer to a living wage, but not really. And the other interesting thing is that it removed the boundaries or the limits that the pension management funds had when investing in government-issued bonds or investment vehicles. So the scenario that I'm fearing, and that a lot of other people are fearing, is that essentially the government is going to force these pension management funds to buy their shit coins, essentially, to buy their securities frauds.
This I don't mean to, that this just so deeply reminds me of SNL crisis, the savings and loan crisis in America. And I just want to quickly explain that, the savings and loan crisis was caused partially because a lot of these banks were allowed to start putting money, these savings and loan associations were allowed to start putting their money into literally anything. And these were customer funds, essentially. These were FDIC insured accounts. They were taking the money from those FDIC insured accounts and spending them however they wanted, because ultimately, if they went bankrupt, if they went out of business, it didn't matter. The money was FDIC insured. The people would just get their money anyway. And so you had a lot of these savings and loans associations just doing the wildest craziest spending mechanisms that you could possibly imagine. And this sounds exactly like that. Like you're just giving free reign to like, go ahead, spend consumer cash however you feel like. And this is a very, very, very dangerous game. It won't end well if this is actually what ends up happening. We've seen it happen in a country as large and powerful as America, and we couldn't control it. We couldn't figure out a way to make it like a reasonable thing that was happening. That is very, very troubling to me. But America has also tried to reckon with our Social Security program. The SSA is in this weird situation where everyone talks about how at some point in the future, it will run out of money and it won't be able to pay out anymore. And I remember when I was young or younger, George W. Bush was talking about privatizing Social Security, which is, again, we're talking about like government doing kind of wacky things to try to offset issues with programs that everyone loves. And I don't know if these are the solutions. I don't know how to, I'm not the one who's coming up with the best solution here, but I'm just trying to say that we've seen this stuff before, even here in America, and it can end really, really, really badly. And so, yeah, what you're saying, again, quite troubling to me.
Isn't it funny that U.S. conservatives tend to describe or tend to suggest things that we already have in El Salvador? And coincidentally, those things are what make El Salvador an underdeveloped country with terrible human rights conditions and violations. That's basically one of my biggest fears right now. And what that thing you say that the pension system in the U.S. is unsustainable, it's already unsustainable in El Salvador with the private pension management funds. To put out an anecdote, I have family that one of my relatives died back in 2020 of COVID, and their partner, their spouse, tried to get their pension money out because, of course, they were going to need it now that they had one less provider in the family after that tragic death. And that was 3 years ago now. He's still fighting because basically the AFPs, the pension management funds, they are not very transparent with their funds because they are private companies. They don't need to be by law, by design. And so I suspect they already have kind of a liquidity crisis. Add to that the fact that in sometime last year, well, El Salvador is dollarized, so we have our reserve of currency that's held by the banks, private banks, and that mostly comes from customer deposits. So they have their reserves, and the government issues bonds, and the banks usually purchase these bonds. But because the value of the bonds have fallen so much, they issued a law last year asking for banks to invest their reserve into bonds, up to 50% of their reserves.
Well, it sounds like they're being held hostage as well. I mean, if you're putting in laws that say your reserves have to be in bonds and they can't be in, I don't know, US dollars or other like US treasuries, that sounds like they're being held a little bit hostage. And that is also not just a liquidity crisis, but kind of terrifying for customers. I don't know, for consumers and customers of banks, I would be worried about my cash held in banking structures.
Everyone is worried, to be honest. And there's many cherries on top of this thing, but another cherry on top of it is that El Salvador is currently in a housing market bubble, and it's been for about a couple of years. San Salvador, if you ever go there, is a rather big city, but it's a city that's in a valley, and outside of the valley, there's the San Salvador volcano. There's the Ilopango Lake. That's also a volcanic lake. We're surrounded by volcanoes, basically. And in the in the metropolitan zone, it's already packed full. The population density is already super high, and so the market prices of housing in San Salvador have skyrocketed to the point where it doesn't really even make sense that to purchase a new apartment. Well, we're seeing kind of like miniature version of the China housing crisis, where they were building towers and towers of apartments that nobody bought because they were too expensive, or because that companies put themselves in debt, and it was just speculation rather than building housing that people actually lived in. That's already happening in San Salvador. There's many towers, I think up to a dozen towers were built last year, that nobody lives there really. It's just speculative investors buying them and hoping to flip them to who knows who, because the average Salvadoran family doesn't have a $11,000 monthly income to pay to even apply for a mortgage for a house like that.
When I imagine inviting a bunch of cryptocurrency millionaires and billionaires who are exempted from a lot of the taxes on their income, will not make that problem better.
I guess they hope to sell a tower or two to, I guess, the next SBF, or I don't know, the next Pablo Escobar. I mean, who is the target audience for these market offerings anyway? I guess who is this mysterious person that has a truckload of cash but no access to banking?
It's funny you mentioned that, because I just spoke to somebody, I won't mention who, but I just spoke to somebody about how seemingly there's no cryptocurrency bank anymore. And like over the past several years, since roughly 2018 or so, we saw Silvergate, we saw Signature, we saw Metropolitan, we saw Evolve Bank and Trust, we saw, Prime Trust. We saw a bunch of these trusts and banks pop up and started working with a bunch of cryptocurrency businesses. As you said, El Salvador is dollarized. Like, this is going to affect the ability for people to move money into and out of cryptocurrencies for dollars. Doesn't matter what country you're in, doesn't matter if you're in the US or elsewhere. So this is going to prove to be a problem. You're making a great point. Like, who's going to be attracted to a bond like this? Perhaps they're right that this is going to be an oversubscribed bond, because a lot of cryptocurrency companies and individuals just got unbanked. They just unbanked themselves.
And that's especially jarring in the context of, like, with the initial prospectus that was passed around, Matt Levine pointed out, like, investment-wise, it was worse than just buying the existing El Salvador debt and a corresponding amount of Bitcoin. The rates, the terms of the bond/token/whatever may have changed in the interim, but assuming that that is still true, then the appealing aspect of it has to be the citizenship. Right? Like, and that you could previously purchase it using Tether, Bitcoin, or cash. So even if you didn't have cash in the banking system, but did have an asset that looked kind of like cash, if you squinted really hard, you were still able to purchase it and presumably still get the corresponding citizenship.
Yes, basically that's the marketing or the prospectus for the country now. Let's attract dirty money.
And it's a sad situation to watch develop.
It is sad, and it's hard to not laugh or cry about this at this point. I mean, I think it's we've been covering this for a long time now, and I think the expectation, the hope, I think there was some level of hope that this could be a net positive for El Salvador. You know, like, I think even when we were talking to Frances Coppola about this, she was like, I can see reasons for them pursuing this. I can see eventual reasons for this. I can see pursuing getting their own currency started and all of this stuff. And it seems like instead of that, they've taken every bad turn imaginable for this bond, so that there's really almost no chance this could be a positive thing, net positive for El Salvador. And it's a huge shame. And it is a stain, I will say, on this idea that, like, I think there's this push by a lot of, let's just call them cultists, that Bitcoin solves problems for any country. If you start to if you start to embrace Bitcoin as legal tender, embrace Bitcoin as the currency of the future, it will help solve all of your country's problems. Well, Nayib is proving to be an authoritarian dictator. We're seeing none of the money used properly. We're talking about building a Bitcoin city in one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. Like, all of it doesn't make sense, and it's really unfortunate that this is the direction it's taken. On that depressing note, Domingo, is there anything you want to add? Is there anything you want people to be thinking about? Places you want them in terms of, like, online to get more exposed to the negative aspects of this, to not just get the positive side of what's going on in El Salvador and with this Volcano token, please, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to shill my Patreon, but I started a Patreon page and the website. It's called riesgos.club. Riesgos like risks in Spanish .club. I've been trying to get it started for like 6 months. I immediately stumbled upon the two realities that it's exhausting and there's no funding for it. I'm not going to profit from this thing, but I'm going to throw it out anyway. I'm planning to publish my review or my opinions and analysis on the law in Spanish on the website, in English on the Patreon page, as well as an English translated version of the law, which I'm working on and will be ready sometime next week, hopefully by the time the episode goes live. Aside from that, just want people to be aware that maybe cryptocurrency fans to be aware that this isn't really helping El Salvador. This isn't really helping. I know it's hard to find criticism of Bukele online because he has a nation's resources to pull trolls and sway the opinion in his favor. But if you look hard enough, you will find some objective criticism and objective opinions and and factual information, actually, rather than the typical YouTuber that's dime a dozen that just throws praises at El Salvadoran Bitcoin. And I guess as evidenced by the downturn in the Bitcoin market as of the last over a year, I think, this isn't a sustainable investment that you can, I guess, make wealth out of. Is just speculation and gambling. That's my message. And in the wise words of the Iron Sheikh, you haven't really you haven't really lived until you suplex a jabroni, which is what I'm trying to do virtually with these columns and this podcast appearances. Trying to suplex the dictatorship out of existence virtually.
Well, good luck with that. Wishing you the best. And on that note, everybody, I want to thank Nayib Bukele for embracing Castcoin. We're going to be launching a Castcoin security on the Bitfinex securities platform. Thank you, Paulo Arduino, for accepting Castcoin. Really huge supporter of that. And I know Tether is going to be listed on Castcoin soon as well. So let's go ahead, hit that like and subscribe button. Let's get Castcoin listed everywhere and the reserve currency of the world.